Hi, I'm Simon Pare, and I'm going to read an excerpt from my sample translation of Abbas Khider's novel The Palace of the Wretched, published by Hanser in 2020. It was in the 7th year of the Iran-Iraq War. Our tribal chief, whose house was right on the border with Iran, came to our village and our house with some relatives of ours. As the eldest member of the tribe, Grandfather Marzuk was to give his opinion and to offer some advice. Father was extremely anxious that morning. The men hadn't announced their visit, they'd simply turned up. They sat in a circle on the floor around my grandfather. I knew 3 of the men. They were my parents' cousins, and the 4th man was our tribal leader. He looked much younger than the other men and had a thin black moustache. A noble-looking brown turban was wrapped around his head, short-cropped hair poked out on the sides, and his white dishdasha, the traditional male robe in our culture, was made of pure silk. The security services want a list of all the young men in the tribe who have run away from the front line. There's no amnesty for deserters now. Give their names and we'll be sentencing them to certain death. I could live with the boys being simply sent back to war. At least they would have some chance of surviving, but they'll be executed. The men stared into their tea glasses or at the carpet as if the answer were to be found there. The tribal leader now turned to Grandfather Marzuk for help. Abu Hussein, you are the eldest. Do you not have some advice? What should we do? Grandfather said nothing for a few seconds, as if collecting his thoughts. Once upon a time there was a powerful sultan, he began. This sultan punished his people because a few brave souls had risen up against him. The ruler sent his soldiers to arrest them, and then forced these men and women to live outdoors for a week like beasts and work for him. He ordered them to harvest air. Anyone who refused was immediately beheaded. The others were taken to an empty square outside the palace, and each had a small sickle pressed into his or her hand. They all had to wear baskets on their backs. The prisoners went along with the Sultan's terrible game. They waved their sickles in the air as if they were cutting grain in the fields, groped at the air, and acted as if they were gathering an invisible substance in their baskets. For 7 long days, the men and women were forced to work outside with no exceptions, without any breaks. On the final day, the Sultan appeared to inspect his work. Among the people, the Sultan saw a naked woman who, like the others, was carrying a small sickle and harvesting air. She showed absolutely no shame, as if she were alone. The Sultan approached her. When she caught sight of him, she attempted to cover herself with her hands. "Oh no, a man," she said. The Sultan was bemused and asked, "There are many people here. You are not ashamed in front of them, but in front of me you are." "People?" she replied, and turned, glaring contemptuously at the crowd. "You mean these scarecrows who couldn't strike fear into a sparrow? These are not people, most worshipful Sultan. These are merely shadows, holding sickles and doing nothing useful apart from harvesting air. You, my lord, are the only real person in this whole land, for you have made everyone else harvest air." Grandfather fell silent and left a long pause to let what he had said sink in. "One day," Grandfather resumed, "our own children will no longer respect us. They will sneer at us. Once we were a proud nation. Now look at you, a bunch of frightened crybabies harvesting air for all eternity. This Saddam, spawn of the devil's navel, is making fools of us. Death is better than cowering in his eternal dungeon." "That's easy for you to say. You have 1 foot in the grave," the tribal leader objected. He looked quite angry. Grandfather lifted his robe to show a jagged, blood-red scar on his stomach. "An English soldier did that to me, stuck his bayonet in my gut. I fought him off with my bare hands, pressing down his rifle until he got tired and I could smash his throat with my fist. In spite of my wound, I watched that English soldier die. Today it is a matter of self-defense too. Just as we once chased out the English, so we can chase out Saddam and the Ba'athists. Anyone who refuses to fight is a coward." The tribal leader leapt to his feet, and it seemed as if he were about to spit in Grandfather Marzuk's face. "You old fool, what hope do we have? If it really came down to it, you wouldn't fight, we would. It's easy to play the general from the comfort of your rocking chair. It would be suicide." For a few minutes it was bedlam, and soon afterwards the men left the room. My father tried to stop them and bring everything back under control, but he failed. Having overheard much of what had happened from the kitchen, my mother also ran after the tribal leader and her cousins, but she couldn't persuade them even to stay and taste her lunch. In a novel, soon afterwards, Grandfather Marzuk dies, and this heralds many of the hardships to come. A couple of years ago I translated Abbas Khider's previous novel, A Slap in the Face, about an Iraqi refugee in southern Germany. This is, in some senses, the other side of the coin. It's in Iraq. It's the story of Shams, who lived through the Iran-Iraq War, the Kuwait War, the American invasion and Saddam's domestic purges, surviving on his wits to support the family in the Tin Quarter, a shantytown miles from the centre of Baghdad. Chance encounters bring him into the company of book lovers and poets, and as their numbers are thinned by death, fear and emigration, he makes a terrible bargain for which he ends up in prison. What I love about the book is the way it combines realism, terribly realistic descriptions, and yet draws on an older tradition of storytelling. It's shot through with humour too, or there are at least moments of humour amidst the great despair.